My sister said, "Dad left you nothing in the will because you disappointed him." I nodded. Then I opened the letter his private attorney had mailed me the week before he died. My sister Vivien delivered the news at 2:18 in the afternoon on the day of our father's funeral, standing in the hallway of his house while guests were still finishing the catered food in the living room and the florist's lilies were dropping petals onto the credenza our father had owned since before we were born. She said it the way she said most things she had been rehearsing. Clearly, with her chin slightly up and her eyes on mine, watching for the flinch. "Dad left you nothing in the will, Lena. Nothing. He told me months ago that you disappointed him one too many times and he wasn't going to reward that." I looked at her for a moment. I thought about the envelope that had been sitting in my kitchen drawer for 11 days, the one with the return address of a law firm I had never heard of, the one I had been carrying around like a stone in my pocket because I had known, somehow, without opening it, that its contents would require me to be ready, and I had not been ready until now. I nodded. I said, "Okay." She blinked. She had expected something else. Tears, argument, the particular collapse of a person who has just been told she has been formally erased. What she got was okay, and I watched her not know what to do with it. I went to get my coat. I need to tell you about my father before I tell you what was in the letter, because the letter only means something if you understand what it was responding to. Bernard Okafor was 72 years old when he died of a second cardiac event in the bedroom of the house in Westchester where Vivien and I had grown up. He was a man who had come from Lagos at 26 with an engineering degree and the kind of specific, disciplined ambition that either burns people out or builds empires. And in his case, it had built an empire. A civil engineering consulting firm that had grown over 40 years into a company with 4 offices, 68 employees, and a revenue that I know, because I later saw the financial disclosures, was approximately $14 million annually. He was a precise man, a controlled man, a man who expressed love through achievement and proximity, meaning he showed you he loved you by expecting great things from you and staying close enough to monitor whether you were delivering them. I spent the first 28 years of my life trying to be what that kind of love required. Then I stopped. What I stopped for was a decision that seemed, at the time, reasonably brave and, in retrospect, was exactly the right call at the wrong moment in my father's emotional development. I was a structural engineer, trained, credentialed, working at a mid-sized firm in Manhattan that did exactly the kind of projects my father's firm did: commercial development, infrastructure, the unglamorous necessary work of keeping cities functional. My father had assumed, without ever making it formally explicit, that I would eventually join his firm. Not immediately, not without proving myself elsewhere first. He was not the kind of man who handed things to people, including his children. But eventually, the timeline in his head was real, even if the conversation had never fully happened. When I was 28, I told him I was leaving structural engineering to go back to school for landscape architecture. I had been thinking about it for 3 years. I had done my research. I had a program accepted, and a plan that made financial sense. My father heard approximately the first 2 sentences of my explanation, and the rest arrived in a room that had already closed. He said, "Belle, you are throwing away your training." I said I was redirecting it. He said, "This is a hobby, not a profession." I said the profession was real, and I had verified that extensively. He said, "Then you'll do it without my support." I said I expected nothing else. We did not speak for 8 months after that conversation, which was the longest silence in our relationship by a significant margin. We reconciled, not fully, not cleanly, but practically, the way my father reconciled with things, by resuming contact as though the rupture had been a weather event rather than a choice. He came to my graduation. He stood in the back of the room and did not applaud but was present, which was the version of approval available in his register. Over the next 7 years, I built a landscape architecture practice. Small at first, then incrementally less small. I had 3 full-time employees and a project list that included 2 public park commissions and a corporate campus contract that was the largest thing I had ever signed. My father did not comment on any of it directly. Occasionally, he would say something adjacent to acknowledgement, "I hear you're busy," in the tone of a man who had decided to stop arguing but had not decided to agree. Vivien, 4 years older than me, had joined the firm at 26 and risen steadily through it. She was competent in the specific, organized way of a person who has built her career inside a structure designed to reward her particular skills. And she had been the reliable child in the way that reliable children often are: present, compliant, increasingly certain of her position. She and I had been close as children and careful as adults, the careful of 2 people who had learned that the same parent processed them differently and had decided not to make that the center of their relationship. We managed. Until the funeral. The first sign that something was not as Vivien had presented it arrived the day after the funeral, when I sat at my kitchen table at 7 in the morning with the envelope in front of me and finally opened it. The return address was Moreau and Associates, a firm I looked up before opening and found listed as a boutique estate and trust planning practice in Midtown Manhattan with, according to their website, a specific specialty in complex family estate structures. The letter inside was 2 pages, on formal letterhead, dated 12 days before my father's death, which meant he had been alive when it was written and had apparently been lucid enough to instruct his attorney to mail it. The attorney's name was Francine Moreau, and I would come to know her well over the following months. The letter began, "Dear Miss Okafor, your father, Bernard Okafor, has retained this firm to manage certain estate matters separate from and in addition to the primary estate documentation being handled by his longtime attorney. He has asked that this letter be sent to you regardless of the circumstances of his death, and that it reach you before any estate proceedings begin." I set the letter down. I picked it up again. I read the next paragraph, which told me that my father had established, 14 months before his death, and without informing any other member of his family, a separate, irrevocable trust. I read the amount in the trust. I put the letter face down on the table and sat with my hands flat on the surface for a while. I want to be accurate about what I felt in that moment, because I think accuracy matters here more than impact. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel vindicated in the clean, satisfying way that stories sometimes describe. What I felt was grief, the specific and complicated grief of understanding that my father had done something significant and had chosen to do it in secret, which meant he had known it needed to be secret, which meant he had understood something about the dynamic in his family that he had never said aloud to me. He had seen it. He had acted on what he saw, and he had died without ever saying any of it to my face. That is not a victory. It is a complicated, bittersweet thing that I am still working through, and I want to say that plainly before I tell you the rest. The trust contained $2.3 million, funded from a combination of personal assets my father had accumulated outside the firm, investments, property, a life insurance policy I had not known existed. Francine Moreau's letter explained that the trust was irrevocable, meaning it could not be contested or altered by the primary estate proceedings, that I was the sole beneficiary, and that it had been structured specifically to be independent of the will, and therefore not subject to the standard probate process that would govern the rest of my father's estate. There was a handwritten note on the second page in my father's handwriting, compressed, precise, the handwriting of a man who had been an engineer and wrote like one. It said, "I know I was not always right. I know I was not always easy. The work you did, I watched it. You were right. This is not an apology. I don't do apologies well. This is what I have instead." I read that note 4 times. Then I put it back in the envelope and called Francine Moreau's office. Francine Moreau was 61 years old, with 33 years of estate law practice, and the measured calm of someone who had managed a great number of family situations that had not gone smoothly. She took my call within an hour of my message, which told me she had been expecting it. She confirmed everything the letter had said, answered my questions with a precision I appreciated, and told me that the trust had been fully funded and that the transfer process would begin immediately upon my formal identification and acceptance. She told me that she had been instructed by my father to ensure the trust was not disclosed to any other family member until I had been notified and had accepted, and that she had complied with those instructions. She said carefully, "Your father was very specific about the sequencing. He wanted you to know before anyone else knew you knew." I asked her why. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think he wanted you to have the choice of how to handle it. He said, and I'm quoting directly from my notes, 'She'll know what to do with it.'" I thanked her and hung up and sat in my office surrounded by the drawings of a park project I was 3 months from completing, and thought about my father knowing what I would do with a thing before I knew there was a thing to do anything with. I did not call Vivien. I did not call my uncle Emeka, my father's brother, who had been at the funeral and who had given me a long look during the reception that I had not fully decoded at the time. I called my own attorney, a woman named Adaeze Nwosu, who had 18 years of practice in estate litigation and had helped me navigate a contract dispute 2 years earlier. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is her best professional quality. And when I finished, she said, "The trust is solid. Irrevocable trusts established with proper legal counsel before death are among the most protected instruments in estate law. Your sister cannot contest it, your father's estate cannot claim it, and the probate process for the primary will does not touch it. You're in a very secure position legally." I said I understood that. I said I was less concerned about the legal security than I was about what was going to happen when the family found out. Adaeze said, "What do you want to happen?" I thought about it. I said I wanted to understand the full picture first, specifically what the primary will said, what Vivien had been told, and whether my father had left any other documentation that Francine Moreau or Adaeze could help me access. Adaeze said, "Give me 2 days." What Adaeze found in those 2 days, working with Francine Moreau and pulling the probate filing that Vivien's attorney had initiated the morning after the funeral, restructured everything again. The primary will, the one Vivien had been referencing when she said Dad left you nothing, was genuine. I was not named in it. The firm went to Vivien with a 20-year buyout structure for the minority shareholders. The house went to a combination of Vivien and a charitable foundation my father had maintained for 30 years. There were smaller bequests to employees and to my uncle Emeka. I was not named. That part was true. What Vivien had not said What she may or may not have known was that the primary will had been drafted 9 years ago and had not been updated since. The separate trust set up 14 months before his death was the update. It was my father's actual final word on the subject of his younger daughter, made in private, with care. Outside the document, his older daughter had been managing the narrative around for at least several months before his death. Adeze said, "Your sister knew about the will. The question is whether she knew about the trust." I said I thought she probably did not. Adeze said, "The fact that she told you about the will the way she did, the phrasing, the timing, in the hallway at the funeral, suggests she thought it was a final word. People don't gloat about final words if they know there's a postscript." The estate reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral, at the offices of my father's longtime attorney, a man named Herbert Oguchi, who had handled my father's primary legal affairs for 22 years. I know Herbert Oguchi's credentials because I researched them. 28 years of practice, specializing in business succession and estate planning for closely held family enterprises. He ran a firm of 12 attorneys in White Plains. He was not aware of the separate trust when I contacted his office to confirm the reading date, which told me that my father had kept the 2 legal tracks entirely separate, using different attorneys, different firms, different documentation. Herbert Oguchi found out about Francine Moreau's trust the day before the estate reading, when I called his office and told him, and then sent him Francine Moreau's confirmation documentation by email. His assistant called me back within 40 minutes to say Mr. Oguchi would like to speak with me before the meeting. I said that would be fine. I drove to his office the next morning. Herbert Oguchi was a careful man with the specific wariness of someone who has spent 2 decades managing family money, and has therefore seen what families do to each other when money is at stake. He had clearly read Francine Moreau's documentation thoroughly before I arrived. He sat across from me and said, "Your father retained separate counsel for the trust without informing me. That's unusual, but it's entirely legal, and the documentation is unimpeachable. I want to be transparent with you. I am the attorney for the primary estate, which means I represent the estate's interests, not yours specifically. I'd encourage you to have your own counsel present at the reading." I said Adeze Nwosu would be with me. He nodded. He said, "I want to prepare you for the fact that this information will be new to your sister. In my experience, surprises of this magnitude at estate readings produce strong reactions." I said I understood. He said, "I'm not asking you to do anything differently. I'm just telling you what I've seen happen." I thanked him. I drove home. I did not sleep well. The estate reading was on a Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Vivien arrived with her own attorney, a man named Clement Azare, who had been representing her in various business matters for several years, and who sat beside her at the conference table with the comfortable ease of a person who expected the proceedings to be routine. My uncle Emeka was there with his own representation. Adeze sat beside me. Francine Moreau attended by phone, patched into the conference room by Herbert Oguchi's assistant. The reading of the primary will proceeded as expected. Everything Vivien had outlined at the funeral was confirmed. When Herbert Oguchi finished the primary will and looked around the table and said, "There is one additional matter," Vivien's expression did not change because she was still in the mode of a person for whom everything was going according to plan. Then Herbert Oguchi said, "Your father established a separate irrevocable trust 14 months ago through independent counsel. I have been provided documentation by Ms. Lena Okafor and the trustee attorney, Ms. Francine Moreau, that this trust is fully funded and legally independent of these proceedings." He paused. "The trust designates Lena Okafor as sole beneficiary. The total value is approximately $2.3 million. Vivien's face went through something I had never seen on it before. It moved through confusion first. The genuine confusion of a person whose model of reality has just been told it is missing a significant variable. Then calculation, rapid and visible, the face of someone running numbers. Then something else, something harder to name, but that I recognized because I had seen it in our father's face occasionally, in moments when he realized something had happened that he could not control. She looked at Clement Azare, who was already leaning toward her. She looked at me. I looked back. I did not perform satisfaction or grief or apology. I sat there and let her see that I had known this was coming, that I had known it for 3 weeks, that I had sat in the hallway at my father's funeral and listened to her tell me I had been left nothing, and I had nodded because I had already read the letter and I had already called Francine Moreau, and I had already met with Adeze, and I had already understood that my father's actual final word was not what Vivien had told me it was. She understood all of that from my face in about 4 seconds. The room was very quiet. What happened next took the form of Clement Azare asking Herbert Oguchi for a recess, which was granted. Vivien and I did not speak during the recess. She and Clement conferred in the hallway. When we resumed, Clement asked on Vivien's behalf whether the trust could be challenged on grounds of diminished capacity. Our father had suffered the first cardiac event 14 months before his death, which was coincidentally exactly when the trust had been established. Francine Moreau's voice came through the conference room speaker with the measured clarity of someone who had anticipated this question and had prepared for it. She said that my father had been evaluated by his cardiologist and his primary care physician at the time the trust was established. that both had provided written attestations of cognitive clarity that she had in the trust documentation as supporting exhibits, and that her own assessment during the drafting and execution of the trust was that Mr. Okafor was fully competent and specifically clear-minded about his intentions. She said, "He was one of the most precise clients I have worked with. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he said so, in those words, at the execution meeting." Clement Azare made a note. He did not ask another question about capacity. The crisis, in practical terms, came 3 days after the estate reading. Vivien called me at 9:43 at night. I remember the time because I had been on the phone with Adeze going over next steps when her call came through on the other line. Vivien's voice was not the voice from the funeral hallway. It was lower, less controlled, the voice of a person who had spent 3 days with her attorney and her accountant, and had arrived at a place she had not anticipated arriving. She said, "I need to understand why Dad did this." I said, "I think he wanted to make sure I was taken care of." She said, "He made sure I was taken care of. The firm, the house share, all of it." I said, yes. She said, "So why was this separate? Why the secrecy?" I had been thinking about this for 3 weeks, and I gave her the honest answer I had arrived at. "Because he knew how you'd received it if it hadn't been." Silence. Then she said, "What does that mean?" I said, "Vivien, you told me at his funeral in the hallway, with people still in the living room, that Dad left me nothing. You said it like you'd been waiting to say it." More silence. Longer this time. Then she said, "I thought it was true." I said, "I know, but the way you said it wasn't about informing me. And I think Dad knew that about you, and he made plans accordingly." The silence that followed that sentence was the longest of the conversation, and possibly the longest I have experienced with my sister. She hung up without saying goodbye. What happened to the firm? To Harrington Properties, which is what Vivien ran for the next 6 months before the structural problems became visible, is, in retrospect, the consequence of a set of conditions that predated the estate and had nothing to do with me. The SEC inquiry that opened 8 months after my father's death related to certain billing practices and contracts the firm had held with a municipal infrastructure program was a matter that Herbert Oguchi's firm had apparently been advising my father on in the final 2 years of his life. This is information I got from my uncle Emeka, who called me 4 months after the estate reading with the specific tone of a man who has been watching 2 things develop simultaneously and has decided it is time to say something. Emeka said, "Your father was worried about the firm. He had been for about 3 years. He thought Vivien was managing it correctly, but he had concerns about certain contract structures she had approved. He didn't want to confront her directly, and he didn't want to alter her inheritance because he felt that would be punitive without due process. But he wanted you to have something that wasn't tied to the firm, because he wasn't sure what was going to happen to the firm." I sat with that for a long time after the call. My father had seen something coming. He had not known exactly what shape it would take. He had done what he could do within the constraints of his own character, quietly, through legal instruments, without the direct conversation he apparently could not manage to have. The SEC inquiry did not result in criminal charges against Vivien. It resulted in a significant settlement, $840,000 paid by the firm, and a consent decree that required restructuring of certain contracting practices. The firm survived but was diminished, and 2 of the 4 offices were consolidated. Clement Azare managed the legal response competently. Vivien's reputation in the industry contracted. She did not lose the firm. She did not lose the house. She lost some things that mattered to her in ways that I think she is still processing. And I say that without satisfaction because she is my sister, and whatever else is true about us, that is also true. I have not used the trust money to compete with my sister or demonstrate anything to anyone. I used $400,000 of it to buy out the lease on a larger studio space that my practice had outgrown, and another $280,000 to hire 2 additional senior architects who had been interested in joining the firm for a year, but whom I had not been able to offer competitive packages. The park commission was completed on schedule and received a regional design award in the spring. The rest sits in the managed account Francine Moreau set up, growing at a pace I check quarterly and otherwise do not obsess over, because I have work to do, and the work is what I am actually here for. My father knew that. He said so in the note, in his compressed engineer's handwriting, without an apology, which is exactly how he would have said it. I have read the note many times. I keep it in my desk, not in a drawer but on top of it, under a glass paperweight that was his, that I took from his office after the estate reading, when Vivien was consulting with Clement in the hallway, and Herbert Oguchi was gathering his papers, and no one was watching me pick up the one thing in that room that I wanted. It is a plain sphere of green glass, heavy, unremarkable. He kept it on the corner of his desk for 40 years. I put it on mine the day I moved into the new studio. Some inheritances are not in documents. Some of them sit quietly in the corner of a room, doing nothing, holding down whatever is underneath them. That is, in its own precise way, enough.